Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my fourth video about the genesis of British science fiction paperbacks. As I indicated at the end of my last video, it wasn't until 1950, the summer of 1950 in fact, before the printing technology and the easing of paper restrictions allowed these mushroom publishers to start issuing decent paperbacks. And here we see the first 8 Vargo Statten titles, published to the end of 1950, and it got off to a great start with this Ron Turner cover for Annihilation, showing a spaceship with the remnants of humanity escaping from the ravaged Earth, which is being destroyed by solar flares and electrical storms. It perfectly illustrated the story. And with successive books, you can see that Ron Turner's artwork was outstanding. Futuristic cities, sleek spaceships, explosions, cataclysms, flying saucers, spacesuits. This one, Nebula X, is one of the very best, and it largely takes place in a transmutation laboratory, whereby there's a transmutation of the elements using atomic bombardments to change lead into gold, for instance. And a similar splendid cover is for the Sun Makers, where an artificial sun is created by the scientists. And these Turner covers were full of a sense of wonder, and they illustrated the stories, and they sort of begged the reader, this is real science fiction, buy me. And we see the progression of the publisher announcing the next title is the Microman rather. There's a reference back there to the first book by John Russell Fearn, which we saw in an earlier video. And then as they progressed, so collectors could follow the progress and watch for the next title. And they're all listed in chronological order. Now then, here's some news for collectors. Quite a lot of people collect the Vargo Statten books, especially in America, and there was 52 of them published initially, and a lot of people will be sitting smugly in their dens counting the 52 Vargo Stattens and thinking, I've got it, I've completed it, I don't have to worry about collecting anything else. Unfortunately, not many people know that with these 2 titles, which I think were probably printed simultaneously, the printer made a bad error. Now that's a Vargo Statten book, that's the one you've got in your collection. But in fact, there was 2 separate editions. Vargo Statten with an O, a printer's error. Now obviously this is the genuine first edition, because as the books were rolling off the press, somebody in the printing department would notice it and would cry, "Stop the presses, it's a mistake." So they stopped the presses, and then the rest of the print run was correct. But obviously being mushroom publishers, they didn't worry about a spell mistake, so both books were put on the market. There we see the genuine first edition, and then we see the rest of the print run with the correction made. Now the question is, how many copies exist of the misprint and how many of the correctly spelt second printing? Now I've been collecting Vargo Statten for over 50 years, and I can tell you that the misprint is very rare indeed. For every 20 copies I've examined, only one of them had the misprint. So if you want to complete your collection, get looking, but expect a long chase to complete your set because the misprints are pretty rare. Now then, the Vargo Statten books were a big success, and they launched the craze for science fiction paperbacks. Now, a lot of people dismissed them without reading them. A lot of fans said, oh, they're coming out too quickly. There must be hack work. John Russell Fearn's churning them out in days. They're not worth reading. But this was a mistake because, in fact, John Russell Fearn had been contributing to the leading American science fiction magazines since the early 30s. And he published about 130 stories in the American pulp magazines. And here we see January 1937 Astounding with the novelette Metamorphosis, with a splendid illustration by Elliot Gould of a melting man, or actually a melting woman in that picture. And there we see the scientists performing the dangerous experiment. And this story, a novelette, was actually the basis for the Sunmakers. Now that story was just about 12,000 words. The Sunmakers was nearly 40,000 words. So Fearn incorporated the story, changed it, and put it in the framework of an original novel. But obviously he could write that book much quicker, having a basis to start them with. Similarly, Nebula X, which is one of Fearn's very best stories, was based on a novelette from a 1946 Thrilling Wonder Stories, and it was originally called The Multillionth, which is Americanese for multi-millionth, The Multi-Millionth Chance, published in 1946. And this was a complete short novel, it was about 25,000 words. So those 25,000 words were adapted for the 40,000 word 1950 version. So these books were actually very carefully written. They weren't dashed off like a lot of the mushroom products. And in fact, this book had originally been written for the American market in 1949. Very carefully written for the American market. But then when Fearn got the call from Science that they wanted more science fiction, he withdrew his manuscript from his American agent. It was never published in America and was published in Britain instead. Similarly, this novel, The Microman, the complete novel had in fact been written in 1946 for Thrilling Wonder Stories, but the editor had rejected it in favour of another novel by Fearn, which he ran instead, and the manuscript was returned. So Fearn had that completed manuscript all ready to send to Science. Similarly with this book, 2,000 years on, it had originally been called Force Shall Avenge, and had been written for a British publisher in 1946, who had already published one Fearn novel, but the publisher failed. The printer wasn't getting paid by the publisher, so the firm closed down, Pendulum Publications. But Fearn had already written the novel. And that's an original story, and that's an original story, but they all had a flavouring, aspects of the old pulp stories from the 1930s and 1940s. So Fearn could turn these out very quickly, but they weren't hack work, and they were very good. And whilst a few of the older fans dismissed them, the general public went for them like crazy, and this became a bestseller. And this wise, the science fiction paperback was introduced to a mass market in Britain and opened the door for other publishers to get aboard. But some of these other publishers as we'll see in the next video, didn't have the ability of Fern, and it didn't have Ron Turner as the cover artist, and the result was pretty gruesome at times, but we'll see that in the next video.